All right, I'll start with my very timely and of the moment first slide. I think we can all generally agree that greater transparency and access to research information is a good thing. Where we often run into difficulties and sometimes disagreements and conflict is over the how of it. What are the best ways to ensure that transparency and to expand that access? We are continuously increasing the burden that is being put on researchers, imposing more and more regulations on them. So if you attended yesterday's keynote speech, you have a very clear picture that remaining in academia is now an alternative career. I used to give alternative careers talks about being a publisher, now I just give careers talks. We've reached a point where a very small percentage of people who receive a PhD are able to one day land a tenure track position at a university, and so what that's done is created a buyer's market for the universities. So because of this, we see universities increasing the demands that they make of their researcher employees. They're required to do more and more beyond the actual research. Administrative tasks, teaching requirements are sort of piled on, and certainly in the sciences, even tenured faculty functions something like freelancers. You're basically required to pay your own way through securing grants. If you want a salary or employees or students, you're going to pay for those things yourself while the university rents you lab space. And if you don't like it, well, there are hundreds of people just as smart as you in line behind you for your job who would be willing to do that extra stuff. So now on top of that, we're piling on some more requirements. If you're doing a research project, you need to take the time to pre-register your experiments and go through some level of peer review on the plans for your experiments before you've even done anything. As you start to do your research, there's this idea that you should be continuously making each piece of data that you uncover public. Again, take the time to write up each incremental piece, post it online, have it reviewed, be a part of discussion around it. When you've completed the project, you need to go write up an early draft, post that as a preprint, make it public, monitor and respond to any comments. Then you need to publish the paper and all the hoops that one has to jump through to do that. Then you need to make the data behind the paper publicly available and help others use it. And if you really want to drive reproducibility, you should write up and release your methodologies. Societal impact is increasingly seen as important, so you have to become your own publicist. You have to promote your work via social media, and at the same time, people may be talking about your paper through post-publication peer review systems, so now you need to monitor all of those, respond to any questions, any criticisms. And then, of course, on top of that, you then have to make sure that you have complied with your institutional, national, and funding agency policies around public access. You have to figure out what those are, and in a recent poll, more than half of researchers did not know their own funders' access policy. You have to figure out the right version of the paper, figure out where it goes, under what conditions, and at what time. And then likely each paper has multiple authors from multiple institutions with multiple funding sources, so you have to do this for a lot of different policies. So that's a huge amount of time we're asking researchers to devote to things that aren't really what they want to do, which is, oops, back a slide, which is research. Nobody goes into science because they love bureaucracy and filling out forms. If we see the purpose of research as benefiting society, then every second we take a researcher away from doing research, away from the bench, that means slower progress. And a lot of institutions are very cognizant of this. They recognize it, so they've tried to shift some of this burden off of the researcher. And that sounds like a great idea unless you're the actual administrator or the librarian who's tasked with this work, which turns out to be both very complicated and very expensive. RORMAP now lists 861 national funding agency, organizational and institutional policies toward providing public access to research papers. And each policy is a little different with variable requirements. And again, because research is increasingly collaborative, most papers have multiple authors with multiple sources of funding, multiple institutions, often multiple countries of origins. And if you start doing the math, the number of possible permutations from combinations of 861 variables is close enough to infinity that most calculators will just throw up an error message if you try and figure that out. In recent years, Surveys of academic libraries found that an average of slightly over 4 library employees devoted at least 10% of their time on open access initiatives. In the first year of the RCUK open access policy, there was a staggering amount of administrative costs for just a fairly low level of compliance. Without careful monitoring and enforcement, a policy, even a mandate, becomes an empty promise. We know that researchers are overburdened, they're short on time, anything that they don't have to do, they won't do. And very often when people come up with goals and they create new rules to achieve those goals, they don't give a lot of thought to compliance, and you end up with a policy that's completely toothless and ignored, or a policy that's followed but at great expense and great effort. It's going fast on me there. So for the publishers in this room, this is an opportunity. Hopefully by now you're all very clear on the idea that you are in the service business, not the content business, and here is a set of services that you can provide to the research community that they will greatly appreciate. The advantages that publishers have in dealing with the requirements around research papers is that we're starting at the source. We know it's being published as it happens, and we can shape those publications to better meet compliance needs. But as I said earlier, we're dealing with scale and complexity, way too many requirements and institutions and funders to sort by hand. So just as we do in many other aspects of our life, when complexity increases, we turn to automation. We take advantage of the sort of approaches that are used to handle big data sets. We can no longer handle compliance paper by paper, so we need alternative ways to process it. How we do this is through persistent identifiers, or PIDs. I assume everyone in the room is familiar with the DOI, the Digital Object Identifier. It's been around since 2000, and it's a way of tagging an object, in this case an electronic document or journal article. The DOI for the article remains fixed over its lifetime, whereas things like the location of the article, the URL where you can find it online may change, but because the DOI for an article doesn't change, if the journal moves from Elsevier to Wiley, we can still always find that article by its DOI. So the DOI gives us a permanent identifier for the article that we can plug into our system for automating compliance. What else do we need to know? We need to know who wrote the article. We need to identify the authors. So for that, increasingly, we have ORCID, the Open Researcher and Contributor ID. And ORCID creates a unique permanent identifier for each individual researcher. And we can now identify the individuals behind the paper so we can try to help them meet their compliance needs. How do we know what those needs are? Through what used to be called FundRef, now the Crossref Open Funder Registry. The registry lists almost 15,000 unique funding agencies, and we can associate the paper with its funders to then know what requirements have been placed upon it. And that combination of three things gives us what we need for our basic system. But to make a really effective system, we could use some more information, and work is in progress and being done on things like institutional identifiers. Where was the work done? Is it from the University of York in England, York University in Toronto, or York College in Pennsylvania? There's also a tremendous amount of development going on licensing identifiers. Is this work the final published version of record under copyright? Is it an open access version of the article under a Creative Commons license? Is this a preprint version? Is it the author's accepted manuscript version? Each identifier provides more and more data to make more efficient systems for automation. Just as a super simple example, PubMed Central. So the NIH's long-running public access policy requires deposit of articles describing NIH-funded research into PubMed Central within 12 months of publication. So at OUP, we deposit the articles on behalf of authors if they identify their paper as being NIH-funded. And in the past, the way we did this was we required authors to use particular wording in their funding acknowledgement section, and we had a system that would look for that wording and flag those papers as needing to be deposited. But since very few authors, as we know, very few authors read author instructions, and because there are so many sub-agencies under the NIH with different names, which authors are likely to misspell or paraphrase, it ends up being a fairly leaky system which requires regular intervention at the copy editing stage. Instead, now that we have installed FundRef, the Open Funder Registry, into the article submission system, now the author is required to identify their funding sources at the time of submission from a controlled vocabulary list of agencies. And then that tags the paper and flags it to us so it can automatically be sent for deposit at the appropriate time. The one remaining manual step in the process is at the page proof stage. We query our authors. We say, this is what is your listed funding. Is that correct? And it gives them a chance to make sure that that's right. A slightly more complex example of this automation via persistent identifiers is Chorus. U.S. federal funding agencies require funded authors to make a version of their articles publicly accessible within 12 months of publication. 7 of those agencies, and now we're working with several international agencies as well, have partnered with publishers to use Chorus to help drive compliance. Essentially, the idea was to take all this infrastructure that we've already built and put it to use for public access rather than making the agencies build their own expensive systems, potentially taking money away from funding research. So as before, we use this Open Funder Registry in our article submission systems. The author identifies the funding sources as they submit the article, and then that adds a tag to the article's metadata. And then using that tag, the article is made freely available in the journal at the appropriate time based on the particular funder's requirements. And no manual intervention from the author or publisher is required. So that information is also used to drive discovery and to monitor compliance. So we've built our own search tools as examples, but really more importantly, we have an open API. Anybody can tap in and use this data and enhance their search tools to show public accessibility of the articles in your search results. And at the same time, we take care of preservation as well. A copy of the paper that is tagged is permanently archived, so if for some reason in the future the free version in the journal is unavailable, the archived version comes to light, so it ensures that public access is maintained in perpetuity. As far as compliance, using our identified papers, we build dashboard tools for member publishers and for funding agencies, and that gives a sort of quick at-a-glance way to track compliance. And then a funder can really drill down to the level of the individual paper. They can see what's been published that lists its funding, when is it supposed to become freely available, and check whether those that should be available have actually become available. And we're now working with a number of university libraries on building similar tracking tools, which our other speakers will hopefully talk about a little bit more to help them ensure compliance on campus. And then just to sum up, we know that time is a researcher's most precious commodity, and they likely won't consistently do anything they absolutely don't have to do to get funding or career advancement. We have a clear example of how to drive strong compliance for public access from the NIH and PubMed Central, and if you sort of compare compliance there where things are automated, due to this very effective partnership between the NIH and publishers, compare that to a typical university repository where you don't have this sort of automated system in place. Everything is meant to be manual and voluntarily deposited, and very little actually gets deposited. So to me, automation is really the key here. There are too many researchers, too many papers, and too many policies for us to do this by hand. Persistent identifiers are really important. A lot of work still needs to be done to fully establish them as industry standards and to fully implement them into our system. So I urge all the publishers out there, if you're not actively involved in driving this process, then you're falling behind the curve, so get to work. So, thanks.